How many of you know the story of the Lost Battalion? How many of you saw that fine, fantastic movie that was done in 2001 of the Lost Battalion? How many of you think the movie was accurate? I'm glad no one put their hand up, because it's not even close. However, it's a movie. It's not a documentary. It's meant to be a piece of entertainment, and as entertainment, it's great. It tells the story in general, and it gets people interested in what happened in the Meuse-Argonne. The Meuse-Argonne is the largest and bloodiest battle America has ever been involved in, then or since. And most people don't know anything about it. For the last 47 days of the war, from September 26th until November 11th, we lost an average of 550 men a day killed in action in the Meuse-Argonne. 3 times that wounded every day. To this day, it still remains a testament to what the United States Army was capable of. Before we went into World War I, we were teenagers. When we came out, we were adults. All right. The story of the Lost Battalion happened in the Argonne Force. This is the most over-reported story of American participation in the war. Okay? If this was the 1920s or 1930s, you'd all know the story. Everybody did. Charles Whittlesey's name, the leader of the Lost Battalion, was on the top of the list. Everybody knew who Chuck Whittlesey was. Today, it's not so much. The movie brings things back. The books bring things back. But at the same time, if we don't have little events like this, all that history goes away. And like I said in the Doughboy presentation this morning, we're witnesses. We need to witness this stuff and pass it along. Otherwise, those stories are forgotten. And our story begins here. Yaphank. Where the hell is Yaphank? Yaphank was a place out on Long Island, a little town out on Long Island. When we got into the war in April of 1917, we were woefully unprepared. Our Army, National Guard, and Marine Corps stood at 250,000. That was it. We ranked 17th in the world in the size of our military force. 19 months later, when the war ended, we had 4 million men in uniform. 2.3 million men in France. That's a 1,700% increase in 17 months. Not only that, but we built an entire infrastructure for them here in the United States to raise, train, equip, feed, and ship an entire army overseas. Then we had to build a complete infrastructure for them in France. When the war ended and the Germans tossed in the towel, the French, the British, and the Germans were scraping the bottom of the barrel. We were just getting started. When we got into the war, we knew that we were going to have to raise a huge army fast. 250,000 standing troops. The Germans had 4 million men in the field. That means we're going to draft people, because the draft worked so great in the Civil War, right? What a great time that was. It's going to be even worse now, because now we have a modern generation that's used to their personal freedoms, that's used to being able to do what they want, that's not used to being told what to do. Can we actually create an army out of these people? Can we draft them and make them do what no one else in America has ever done? We are going to take an army and send them overseas for the very first time. We're going to fight on a foreign shore. Not for land, not for gold, not for power, but for an ideal. Can we do this? It's a big roll of the dice. It's a big gamble. And we're going to draft these people. And one of the interesting things about America at that time, you have to remember, we have an awful lot of immigrants in this country. First and second generation. A lot of them don't speak English. They came over here. And one of the interesting things about the draft was you didn't have to be a citizen to be drafted. You just had to live here. So these guys who left Poland or Germany because they didn't want to get drafted into the army over there are now going to get drafted into the army over here. By and large, they accepted it as part of the price that they would pay for their new country. So we're going to raise this giant army. And it's going to be a huge army. Divisions at that time were 27,000 men. Okay, we're going to get into that a little deeper in a moment. But we need to raise, the numbers will be from 76 to 100. Those are the divisions that will be raised by the National Army, the draft army, 76 to 100. And the one that is developed for the New York area, the greater New York area, is the 77th Division. The 77th Division will be raised primarily, their enlisted will come from New York, from the east side of New York, and they will train at Camp Upton. Camp Upton is one of 16 cantonments that are set up across the country. By the time Camp Upton shuts down in 1920, they are capable of raising and training and equipping an entire 60,000 men at a time. Once again, the draft is instituted, and on the first draft call, we have 10 million names on the list. We're just getting started when the war ends. Had the war gone on into 1919, you would have seen what America was really capable of doing. The 77th Division at Camp Upton takes as their emblem the Statue of Liberty. What could be more fitting for a unit that comes from New York City? All these enlisted men come into this division, and the enlisted men, by and large, they're good, hardy stock. The officers come from the Plattsburgh Officers Training Program. This is something that's put together by General Leonard Wood starting in 1913. He's taking the best and brightest of New York society, and he's giving them a 30-day course so that he can assess whether they're going to make good officers or not. Not really training them, but getting them ready. Will they be good officers? By 1915, everybody's pretty sure we're going to get into the war. Anybody with brains can see it coming. So, it becomes even more important that we have this officer corps ready to go. And one of those guys that's in the officer corps, well, hang on, is this guy, Charles White Whittlesey. Charles Whittlesey is a 36-year-old attorney who lives in New York City. He's originally born in Florence, Wisconsin, little town about 14 miles south of the Michigan, the UP border. I've been up there many times. There's not a lot there. Wasn't a lot there then either. Whittlesey spends his first 14 years in Wisconsin. Then he goes back with his family to Massachusetts, where he grows up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Graduates Pittsfield High School, goes to Williams College. It's a prep school. Very happy with this place. Then he goes on to Harvard Law, and he becomes a lawyer, deals in contracts and negotiations. He's an extremely, extremely smart man. He looks a lot like a professor. In any case, as a lawyer, he very rarely loses anything, and as a matter of fact, other lawyers bring him cases for him to look at so that he can go through them. When he gets into the officers training program, he first goes in 1916. He goes to the 1916 course, and not because he necessarily wants to, but because one of his other office rats challenges him to. Had gone in 15, and in 15, when they came home, they were told, challenge 2 other people that you know to come back in 16. Charles Whittlesey came back. He doesn't necessarily believe in military preparedness. He is a socialist through and through. Socialism back at that time was swept through the American education system, much like it does today. And he was a dyed-in-the-wool socialist. He truly believed that socialism was the way to go. At the same time, he also believes in capitalism because he's making an awful lot of money as a lawyer. He's a happy guy. So he goes, and he comes through this course so well that they decide that if he comes back in 17, they're going to jump him up in rank. That's exactly what happens. He goes back in 17 after the war is declared, and he graduates from the 90-day program, the first of the 90-day wonders. He graduates as a captain. But they also realize this guy's not a combat commander. He's a paper pusher. He's good with numbers. He's good with people. So they put him in charge of the headquarters company of the 308th Infantry. There are 4 infantry regiments in a unit at that time. Well, wrong way. Come on. You'd think I'd know how to do this by now. You'd be wrong. There it is. All right. As I said, divisions were 27,000 men at that time. These are massive divisions. They're twice as big as European divisions. And they're broken down into 2 brigades. Each brigade has 2 regiments. Each regiment has 3 battalions. Each battalion has 4 companies of 254 men. So as it breaks down, You have the 77th Division with the 154th Brigade, which contains the 307th and 308th Infantry, and each one of those has each a battalion and 4 companies. Y'all got that? There's going to be a test later. I don't think they believe me. In any case, the headquarters company of the 308th Infantry, Whittlesey is put in charge of it because he's good at what he does. He's an administrator. Later on, those administrative capabilities are going to show themselves in a different way, because they ship over to France in April of 1918. The entire division goes over. They're a good division, good, strong. They've trained as regiments. They're ready to go. They feel they're ready for combat. They put them in the Baccarat sector. Baccarat is at the foot of the Vosges Mountains. Not a lot going on there. It's a quiet sector. This is where they're going to get their baptism of fire. This is where the 77th gets their feet wet. They're hanging out with the French. The French are teaching them about trench warfare, teaching them about artillery, machine guns. Yeah, they're getting into some stuff. It's quiet until the Americans get there and we start stirring things up. When they leave at the beginning of July in 1918, they're feeling pretty cocky. We saw some frontline service. We know what we're doing. Then they went to the sector of the Vesle. The Vesle River is the line that the Germans fell back to in the summer of 1918, following the battles around Château-Thierry and Belleau Wood. When our divisions, the 2nd and 3rd Division, managed to push the Germans back, they stopped on the far side of the Vesle, that as far as they wanted to go. So the 4th Division, the 77th, the 32nd, the 42nd, they come in and they're supposed to push the Germans back. This is where the 77th realizes they're not what they thought they were. The guys used to say that Baccarat was a pushing and shoving match. The Vesle was a real fist fight. This is where they find out what warfare really is. They start taking heavy artillery fire. It's a long, hot summer. The Germans are throwing around a lot of gas. And poison gas was the Agent Orange of World War I. It may not have hurt you during the war, but after the war, it killed thousands. Inhale poison gas, particularly mustard gas, it would burn everything all the way down, and there was nothing they could do. Mustard gas is not actually a gas, it's a liquid. Comes in little vials and was delivered in 75 millimeter shells or 77 millimeter shells that exploded and vaporized the gas, and it would settle on things. And if you brushed up against something that had it on it, you got it on your skin, it'd blister your skin. And you went to wipe it off, now you got it on this hand. Stories of men would take their jacket off and they'd peel a layer of skin off with it. One guy in Wisconsin, his name was Woody. He was in the 32nd Division. Woody got gassed in France. Woody lived to be about 102, and he used to tell the story all the time. He had to go to the bathroom. He was in France, and he went down in a shell hole. Did what he had to do. He didn't have any paper. So he reached over and he grabbed a handful of leaves. The leaves had mustard gas on them. And Woody burned everything. And he'd tell you, it healed like leather. You want to see? No, that's all right, Woody. Gas was no joke. They also learned that you didn't sleep 1 in a hole. You get your throat cut. You didn't sleep 2 in a hole. You'd wake up to find your buddy's throat cut. You slept 3 in a hole. One guy awake at all times. The Germans were past masters at infiltration. They'd put on American uniforms, slip across the line, get into American chow lines. It didn't matter if they had an accent. Everybody in the 77th had an accent. There were 42 different dialects and languages spoken in the 77th Division. Didn't matter. They'd learn what they needed. They'd go back. They'd find Germans infiltrating the line everywhere. But most of all, what they found out on the Vesle was that the 77th was failing. The units were not working and playing well with each other. The regiments were not working together. There was too much competition between them. This is a major failing because the 77th is the first national army, the first draft army division to get to France. If the 77th fails, we don't have another army. The 77th can't fail. They have to succeed. So Pershing, being who he was, decides the problem is at the top. And he decides to replace the commander, Major General George Duncan. George Duncan is not a well-loved individual in history. He's not considered a very smart general. He has command of the 77th as they're falling apart. Pershing exchanges him for Major General Robert Alexander. Robert Alexander had started out as a private, worked his way all the way up to general. He did not go to West Point. He went to the officers' training school. He went to the school of the line. So he thought he was less than the other officers, and he had a Texas-sized chip on his shoulder. He had everything to prove, and Pershing knew this. So Pershing puts him in charge, and he says, fix that division. The first thing that Bob Alexander does is he comes in, he gathers all his line grade officers, brings them in, and he says, now listen, you guys, we need to fix this. This can't fail. And he tells them what he wants to do and how he wants them to do it. Then he brings on all his sergeants, and he says the same thing. Listen, you fellows, I was in your place, and I know you are the guys that make things work. You need to do this, and I will not take no for an answer. So later, as they're moving through within the next 10 days, the 77th begins to function as a unit. They begin to win. They begin to gather strength. They're working together now. Everything's working out just the way that Alexander wants it to. Under his tutelage, the 77th will rack up more kilometers of advance against the enemy than any other division in France. They will also be third on the list of casualties. Now, it's a good thing that Alexander has got these guys where he needs them, because they are about to go into the biggest and largest battle in American history, the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Before this 47-day offensive is done, 1.6 million doughboys will see action on this front line. It's divided into 3 sections, 3 corps, 1st, 5th, and 3rd Corps. Each corps has 3 divisions in it. You can see from left to right, 77, 28, 35, 91, 37, 79, 4, 80, 33. This is who starts the battle. And they're going to push forward. Now, on the far left is the 77th Division. The main line runs from the far side of the Argonne Forest to the Meuse River, 22-kilometer wide battlefront. On the far left is the 77th Division. They are the only division that will fight completely within the confines of the Argonne Forest. And the Argonne Forest is a nasty, nasty place. They were not to take the forest in force. For centuries, armies have fought around the Argonne Forest. It is far too thick. There's very few roads within it, hills, valleys, ravines, swamps, streams everywhere. There's places in the Argonne Forest that you can't see 10 feet in any direction. When the leaves are out in the Argonne Forest, there's sections where the sunlight never touches the ground. One step on solid ground leads to another step where you're sinking up to your knees in slop that you didn't know was there. It's an awful medieval place. It truly is a jungle. The underbrush this year when we went in July was absolutely incredible. It took us hours to go an area that should only take minutes. It was awful. This is what they're going to go into. The largest woodland expanse between the Baltic and the North Sea. It is about 6 kilometers wide, and it's 32 to 35 kilometers long, depending on where you are. The 77th is going to go in there. But like I said, they're not going to take it. On the left, the French 4th Army is going to go up the left side of the forest. On the right of the 77th is the U.S. 28th Division. They will push up on the right side of the forest. They are to meet at the top at a town called Grand Pré. If the Germans do not pull out, they will get surrounded because the 77th is keeping steady and even pressure on them from the bottom. The first phase of this battle is supposed to take 72 hours. It took 12 days. These guys did not go in prepared for what they were going to face. Probably the biggest problem that they had was that they received almost 1,300 recruits into the 1st Battalion of the 308th Infantry just before they went in. These are guys that just came over from the States. They'd been drafted in May and June. By August, they were in France. By September, they're going into combat. They didn't know anything. The need for men in France was so great that what they were saying to these guys is, don't worry about basic training. This is who to salute, how to salute, when to salute, and where to salute. This is how to march. You'll get everything else you need to know in France. Hand them a rifle, send them overseas. The need in France to get them to the front was so great, they said, you already had basic training, that's good enough, come on, you're going to the front. They'd send these guys to the front, they didn't know anything. And the 308th Infantry takes in a lot of these replacements, and it's going to be a tough pull for those guys. A country that died long ago and in pain. That's how they described the lower portions of the Argonne Forest. The Germans had been in the Argonne Forest for 4 years. They'd put together basically a city inside the forest. In 1914, 1915, and 1916, the French had tried to take the forest back. Lost 120,000 men in there, killed. 4 times that wounded. Before they decided in 1916, this line, we can't take it, it's going static. It became a quiet sector. Beautiful forest, absolutely beautiful. And the Germans decide, well, let's make it a rest camp. So they put up everything that these guys would need. Hot and cold running water, electricity, beer halls, beer gardens, bowling alleys. They had movie theaters. They had 2 full-size concrete swimming pools. You could get anywhere you wanted, a narrow gauge rail system, roads everywhere, telephone systems, hot and cold running water. They had it all. But they were still military establishments. They were still military establishments. There are bunkers, concrete bunkers everywhere. Anybody here know anything about concrete? The chert content in concrete is what makes it stiff and makes it hold together. I wish they'd use that same chert content in our roads around here. They'd probably last a lot longer because all these bunkers are still out there in the forest 100 years later, and they're in great shape. At any given time in this forest, the Germans could hit anything they wanted with artillery. It was a pre-sighted artillery target. There were machine guns everywhere. There's trenches everywhere, miles of barbed wire. They could do anything they wanted, and they could hold out as long as they wanted. And this is what the 77th is pressing against. There's the swimming pool. That's pretty cool. Good duty, I guess. On the morning of September 26, 1918, they go over the top into the Meuse-Argonne offensive. 2,600 field pieces fire for 6 hours into this line. There is more weight of artillery fired in those 6 hours in this 122-kilometer line than the entire Union Army fired during the entire Civil War. They blow that line to hell. And the Germans begin to fall back almost immediately. That's a good thing, because when the units went over the top, especially the 77th, into that forest, they fractured. Too much powder smoke, too much fog, too much dark, and the ground was churned up into nothing. The units fell apart almost immediately. It took days to tie the ends together. And the 1st Battalion of the 308th Infantry is being led by this guy here, none other than our pal, Charles Whittlesey. Whittlesey got the job as combat commander of the 1st Battalion, not because he knew what he was doing, because he was next in line. On the Vel, they lost 3 1st Battalion commanders, 2 killed and 1 wounded, before they brought Whittlesey in. And there was considerable controversy about it. But the machine gun officer in the 307th, who had served with the Canadians at Vimy Ridge, told Bob Alexander, Whittlesey's the only one that can ever tell me what's going on over there. He got the job, and he decides that he's going to take all that knowledge that he knows about sticking to the rules, about managing people, managing numbers, and he's going to do the best job that he can taking these guys in. Unfortunately, he starts in handicapped. Whittlesey got gassed on the Vel, and he never reported it. So when he goes over the top that day, he can hardly breathe and he can hardly talk. But he's determined not to let these guys down. Now remember, he got gassed, because you're going to need to know that later. And that's not a joke, that's true. The other handicap that they've got is the 77th is here. The 308th is on the far left. Right next to them is where the French should be. In between the French and us is the 368th Infantry. This is a liaison unit. Liaison between the French and us. The 368th Infantry is black troops. Black troops were not treated well in the First World War. They were not trained well. Why they put them in there is still anybody's guess. But these guys are not going to be able to hold up their end of the bargain and are not going to be able to keep the line on. Trained right, they are not equipped right, and they were not given enough artillery preparation for what they had to face. So when Whittlesey moves off and goes farther into that forest, almost from the beginning, his left flank is left open. Partly because of the 368th and partly because you'll see this triangle right here. These two lines right here represent the dividing lines between the 77th and the 368th. Notice that they're walking away from each other. Nobody notices this until 1983. The two lines did not coincide, so there was a constant area in between the two units that was never covered by anyone. Now, it was an informal agreement between the units that were there that they would eventually cover it together between the French after the 368th got pulled off the line. So that was eventually covered, but in the beginning it wasn't. Whittlesey's left is open right from the beginning, and they push forward. And they push forward into some absolutely awful terrain. It takes 2 days for Whittlesey to get his men back together, to become an effective combat organization, to fight against the Germans as they push forward into this absolute nightmare. He's losing men left and right, and a huge amount of them are the replacements that came in that didn't know what to do. Whittlesey, being who he is, starts to take this personal. He is going to command this unit. And as you well know, people who've been in the service know you have to delegate. And if you don't delegate, then you are accepting responsibility for everything, for things that are not your responsibility. Whittlesey begins something that they call the mama hen syndrome. He's trying to keep control of all his chicks because they're not ready to go. And he knows it, but he can't. He's not relying on his field grade officers as much as he should. And he's not sleeping. He's not taking care of himself. And as they move forward, it rains almost every day. They have nowhere inside to sleep. The 72-hour time frame falls apart. They don't have enough food. They don't have enough water. The only thing coming up is ammunition. Getting the wounded back from the front is taking 6 hours per man. They're not prepared for this. It is an absolute nightmare. And Whittlesey feels responsible for all of it. As they push forward, the 368th's attack pattern, though, is wide open. They have wide open area to the left of the forest. But they don't have the firepower to keep the Germans away. They're attacking across wide open fields without any covering fire. And they're falling back, constantly falling back, constantly falling back. The farther Whittlesey gets into the forest, the wider that gap on his left is. Until finally he's given on September 27th the orders to go across a hill called Lone Moor, the Hill of the Dead Man. And as he pushes forward, you can see the red lines there. You can see where the opening is on his left. And on the right, his line is falling back. It's keeping back. The Germans are pushing them back. Whittlesey's the only one that's managing to push his men forward. Moulin de Lone Moor. On September 28th, they are ordered to take this mill. He's to go over the top of this hill, which he does. That afternoon finds him on the opposite side of the hill, the north side of the hill, facing the Germans. Artillery fire coming over is going to fall on that hillside. The 368th is nowhere to be found on his left. And on his right, in direct violation of the orders, the 2nd Battalion of the 308th faces heavy artillery fire and falls back without orders. General Alexander had told them before going in, you will advance without regard to flanks or losses, no matter what. That's actually a good military action, because if you attack without worrying about your flank, this guy attacks without worrying about his flanks. And this guy attacks without worrying about his flanks. You all move together as a line, don't you? Works great, doesn't it? You look dubious. Why would you be dubious? It's not working out. The 2nd Battalion falls back and leaves Whittlesey's right open. Now, he is a sea. He is a little blob of green in a sea of field gray out on the north side of this hill. And the Germans wake up to what's going on and infiltrate behind him. This area becomes known as the Small Pocket. And that's where he's trapped and where the lines are. He's out there with no liaison in any direction for at least 600 meters. And this is where he will sit for the next 3 days, taking fire from the Germans. Now, the thing that saves him is that the Germans are actually pulling back to a main line of resistance called the Gisela Stellung. They're in the midst of falling back, and what's got him surrounded is a rear guard machine gun unit. That's all they've got. But they are determined to try to destroy these guys. Whittlesey starts sending out pigeon messages from that hillside. Now, communication is the big bugbear in the First World War. There is no two-way voice communication yet. Had there been, the war would have played out a lot different. What we have instead is telephone. Great idea. But you got to string a line for telephone, which is usually broken right off the bat. Or you have runners. As they would move forward, they would station runner posts behind them. Run a message back every 100 yards, give it to a new guy, go back. It's great because you got an observant person who's carrying the message. It's bad because it takes a long time. Or they had pigeons. Pigeons were great. Send the pigeon up, the pigeon would take the message back, but that was one way. Whittlesey is trapped on this hillside. He starts sending pigeons out. Hey, I need resupply. I need resupply, and I need it right now. I need my wounded out of here. I don't have any food. We're running out of ammunition. He takes up a position in this bunker. It's hard to see, but the left picture is the bunker in 1918. The lower right picture is what it looks like today. He takes his position in here. He's got his men set up in a hollow square around him. And eventually, on the night of the 28th, he decides, I got to do something about this. So he sends these 3 men out. Lieutenant Arthur McCall, who is his adjutant, Private John Monson, and Private Jack Hershkowitz. They work their way back, and by the morning of the 30th, they managed to get back and bring word, look, you got to take care of these guys. This is bad. The 77th manages to battle up forward and get there. And by the night of the 30th, their position is relieved. This is a close call. This is a close call, and it is a preview for what's about to happen. Because the next day, October 1st, they are told to charge directly up a wide, deep ravine ahead of them called the Ravine d'Argonne. This is a nasty slit through the forest. They have to be up on both heights and down in the ravine and charge forward. On the left is a German hill, Hill 205, that's towering above them. On the right is Hill 198. The Germans are pouring fire down on them inside this ravine. They push forward. They fall back on the first. We can't do it. They take massive casualties. Whittlesey tells his commander, Colonel Cromwell Stacy, we can't do this. We can't go up there. And he calls back to General Johnson and says, or General Alexander, and he says, General, if you send him up there, I'm not taking responsibility for this because that's suicide. The general says you are to take your position regardless of flanks or losses. Push forward. Most people don't understand that in combat, one thing matters: obtaining your objective. And if it costs everybody in the unit to do it, then that's the price. Obtain your objective. Alexander understands this, and so does Whittlesey. Whittlesey pushes his men forward. They have a new attack plan. I love this part. Hell, we weren't lost. The Germans knew where we were the whole time. This is what the ravine looked like 2 years ago, a couple of years ago. This is their new attack plan. Not only are they going to charge straight up that hill, but they're going to charge against 205 and 198 at the same time. They hit everything, then the Germans can't possibly throw anything at them. Right? Wrong. It didn't work out. They charge up that ravine on the 1st, and they get their ass handed to them. A new plan comes back and is given to them. Whittlesey says, all right, fine, I'll attack. Whether you're going to hear from me again or not, I don't know. He argues with Stacy, but he is told to charge forward. This is what they're going to do. They're going to leave 2 units on the left. That's number 2. They're going to attack Hill 205. Number 3 is the 307th Infantry on their right is going to attack Hill 198. In the middle, number 4 is Whittlesey. He's going to push forward over the corner of Hill 198 with his men. And it all works out the way that it's supposed to. These guys hold the guys on 205 busy. The 307th gets to the top of the hill. And as they're on the top of the hill, everybody in front of Whittlesey goes over to fight the 307th. And while they're fighting the 307th, Whittlesey scoots over the top of the hill with his men, drops down into the Charleville Ravine on the other side, crosses that ravine, and digs in to the south side of the hill. Why the south or the north side of the hill? German artillery fire can't get him. He learned from the small pocket. He digs in to the north side of the hill between a road on the top and a narrow road on the bottom, in an ellipsis about 300 meters long and about 60 meters wide. Over the next 5 days, this becomes known as the pocket. That night, the Germans realize what happened, slip into the main line behind him, and close him off 2.5 kilometers ahead of the main line. Now, he's truly and well screwed. Exactly what he told his commander was going to happen has happened. He's trapped again. He's got about 700 men in the ravine with him, and they start taking fire almost immediately from Germans in all 4 points of the compass. Yeah, you can't really see that one. So this is how they set things up. The different companies that are in there, they have 9 machine guns with them. The left flank is more open, so they put 6 machine guns over there. They put 3 on the far right flank. And the Germans start unloading on them almost immediately. By the morning of the 3rd, Whittlesey wakes up, they have no food. They're almost out of water. Ammunition's already running low. Hand grenades are a thing of the past. And they're starting to take big-time casualties. And the senior chief medical officer, medical enlisted who comes to him is a guy named Jack Garris. Whittlesey asks him how he's doing, and he says, we have nothing left. We have no bandages, no medicine, no nothing. They dig a long, low hole at the bottom of the hillside, and they start laying the wounded out there. Some pictures of what the pocket looked like. Boy, I wish it was darker in here. George G. McMurtry is the second in command under Whittlesey. He's got 2nd Battalion, the elements of 2nd Battalion in there with them. Okay, George McMurtry, he was a Rough Rider with Teddy Roosevelt. He went up Kettle Hill. He knows combat. He's 42 years old. And he tells Whittlesey, listen, I don't think we should stay here. I don't think this is a good idea. I think we need to pull back. We still have an opportunity to get out of here. Whittlesey says, no, our orders are to stay put. And he says, all right. On the morning of the 3rd, early morning of the 3rd, Company K of the 307th Infantry manages to break through and bring in 97 additional men under the command of Captain Nelson Holderman. Nelson Holderman is a National Guard officer. He loves combat. He is absolutely in his element. He is all about what's happening, and he loves it. Even he goes in and looks around and says, I don't think this is a good idea at all. And Whittlesey says, those are the orders. So Nelson Holderman takes his men over to the far right flank, and they set up this perimeter. And they got to get ready because the shit is really hitting the fan now. By the evening of the 3rd, they are taking massive fire from machine guns all around them. Small arrows are machine guns. The 3 or 4 big arrows, those are trench mortars. The trench mortars are really starting to unload on them. Within the first 48 hours that they're in this position, they will take 42% casualties. The dead and the wounded are piling up. They don't have anything to take care of these guys. One medic goes out with a small unit to try to break through to the back and is captured. One medic is wounded. That leaves 3 left to take care of almost 650 men. Massive amounts of wounded are being laid out in this hole. These are terrible wounds. There's nothing they can do for them. They're taking the bandages off the dead to use on the wounded. They're using underwear, cartridge belts, spiral puttees, anything to bind up wounds. By the morning of the 4th, they're leaving the maggots in the wounds because they know that they'll only eat the dead flesh. They don't have any cigarettes. There's nothing they can do for these guys except give words of advice. The hardest part comes on the afternoon of the 4th. While they're under fire from the Germans, there were also 3 men from the 305th Field Artillery in there with them, 2 enlisted and an officer by the name of John Teichmuller. John Teichmuller is in as bad a shape as everybody else, mentally and physically. He's worn out. He sends a pigeon message out requesting counter battery fire on a couple of these trench mortar positions. Unfortunately, he's so worn out that when he sends the coordinates out, he transposes 2 numbers in the map coordinates. When that artillery barrage that he calls for falls, it falls farther back. And that's number 1 on the line here. That is the main line of resistance. So his main line is getting hit. When the artillery lifts the fire, when they realize what's happening, they lift the fire, they realize what Teichmuller did. Adjust those coordinates and drop a line on the top of Hill 198, which is a great place to be. The Germans are up there. Let's drop artillery on them. General Alexander wakes up and says, you know what? Let's drop a line of fire behind Whittlesey as well. Keep them off his back till we can fight through to him. The whole time, the rest of the 308th and the 307th is fighting to get through to Whittlesey. It's almost a constant battle. Unfortunately, they believe that Whittlesey is on the south side of the ravine, not the north side. So when they drop that barrage on the north side of the ravine, it falls directly on Whittlesey's position. And for 2.5 hours on the afternoon of the 4th, Whittlesey is bombed by his own artillery. They're starting to take casualties. And as this goes on, Whittlesey realizes that something's got to happen. McMurtry grabs him and says, oh, God damn it, we got to do something. Whittlesey grabs his pigeoneer, a guy by the name of Omar Richards. And he tells Richards, he said, we got to get a message out. And he writes that message. We are along the road, parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. He hands it to Richards. Richards has 2 pigeons left. 2. He reaches into this coop and he pulls a pigeon out. And as he does, a shell goes off right down the way. And it scares him. And he drops the pigeon. The pigeon takes off. Whittlesey says a really, really rude word. Richards reaches in and grabs his last pigeon. This is Cher-ami. This is the one that everybody knows is Cher-ami. They didn't know what the pigeon had a name. They weren't petting the pigeon and talking to it. It was just a pigeon to them. So he takes this message and he wraps it up and he puts it on the pigeon's leg and he tosses the pigeon in the air and the pigeon flies up and lands in a tree. Home in 1919. He went on a bond tour. They sent this thing on a bond tour. And when the bird died, they stuffed the bird and then sent the bird to Smithsonian, where the bird is to this day. You can go see Cher-ami to this day. Sherman Eager and his family turn a corner in the Smithsonian, and there in a glass case is Cher-ami. The last time Sherman Eager had seen Cher-ami was in October of 1918. And he said he remembered running down across the bottom of that hill and hearing those pigeons cooing. And it was the most mournful sound he'd ever heard. And he started telling the story. And by the time he got done, everybody in the museum was standing around him. And he looked at his kids and he said, if it wasn't for that pigeon, none of you would be here. Everybody loves a good animal story, right? Here's another animal story. The senior medic was a guy by the name of Jack Garris. Somewhere along the way in France, Jack had managed to pick up a little terrier pup named Billy. And he carried Billy everywhere he went. Billy was his big buddy. And even when they got into the Argonne and they got trapped in the Charlevaux Ravine, Billy was with him. And as he went to each wounded man and tried to take care of him, the dog would come along. And nothing brings a smile to anybody's face like a dog that you can pet, right? During the artillery barrage, just beforehand, Garris had dug a little lean-to into the side of the hill, and into it he had put the most horribly wounded to give them a sense of false security, but also to keep everybody else from having to look at them. He was in there during the barrage when an artillery shell landed almost directly on it, and he was completely buried. He said he could move one arm and one leg, and he couldn't breathe, and he realized, I'm going to die. This is the end. So he started making his amends and saying goodbye to people in his mind until he found a scratching at the back of his head and on the side of his face. It was Billy digging him out. Billy got him out to where he could get out and reach a shovel, dig his way out. And he realized that everybody was dead, so he grabbed the bird, or he grabbed the dog, and he ran down to the bottom of the hill to see what he could do down there with the rest of the wounded. Down there was Jimmy Bragg and Irving Sirota, the other two medics. Jimmy Bragg was from West Virginia, and after the war, he got into bootlegging, and he got picked up, and he was brought before the sheriff, and when he did it, he had all his medals on. He had gotten the Distinguished Service Cross for his work with the Lost Battalion, and the sheriff said, "What you got there?" He said, "Those my medals." I said, "Where'd you get them?" He said, "I got them in the war," and he told them all what had happened. And the sheriff looked, and the judge looked at the sheriff, and he said, "You get on out of here. He can do anything he wants to. Never pick him up again." Irving Sirota was the other one. Irving Sirota was from Russia. He was a Jew from Russia, and he was dirt poor when he came to the United States. But he had an air about him. They called him the Baron. He thought that was the coolest thing in the world because he was just a dirt poor farmer. No, he's the Baron. And he would walk around and treat himself like a baron. And everybody got a kick out of Irving Sirota. He was a great guy. He got the DSC too. If you saw the movie, you saw that part where Lieutenant James Leake was captured. Following the artillery barrage on the 4th, the Germans came in on the right flank and captured a bunch of guys and brought them back. One of them was Lieutenant James Leake. He was a lawyer from Texas. And he had a very, very, very laid-back demeanor about him. And when the Germans started to question him about how many men they had out down in the ravine and stuff, he told them flat out, "They're New Yorkers. They're gangsters. You'll never take them. They'll never give up." And he had the Germans spooked. There were two other guys in there too. They managed almost convince the Germans that there were 2,000 men in that ravine with plenty of ammunition. And the Germans were almost buying it, but not quite. On the morning of the 6th, something strange happened. An airplane flew over and started dropping packages. This will be the first attempted major aerial resupply in U.S. history. It's decided that these guys need resupply. So, General Alexander went to the Air Corps and said, "Can you drop some stuff to these guys? Sounds like a good idea to me." And they went, "Sure, no problem." They assigned it to the 50th Aero Squadron. 50th Aero Squadron used as their emblem the old Dutch cleanser girl. She was cleaning up on the Germans in France. On that morning, they flew down across the ravine, and the Germans were opening up on them. And at the hands of the stick was Lieutenant Harold Gettler. His backseater was Lieutenant Irwin Bleckley. Bleckley was from Wichita, and Gettler was from Chicago. As a matter of fact, in 1914, Gettler, whose family was German, tried to join the German army in Chicago. They told him, "Go home, kid. We don't need you." By the time we got in, he was a dedicated American. He got in to the Air Corps because he said, in the Air Corps, you don't come back missing an arm or a leg or an eye. You just don't come back. He was okay with that. He was also older. He was 27 years old. He was considered the old man of the squadron, so they called him Dad. His backseater was Irwin Bleckley from Wichita. He was a banker's son, very studious, very, very dedicated individual, very quiet. A very, very nice man, was engaged. And that morning, as they flew over the ravine, they weren't sure that they were dropping the packages in the right way. And that's not because nobody knew where these guys were. It lost battalion. It wasn't lost because nobody knew where they were. They all knew where they were. And the Germans, they said the same thing. The Germans knew where we were. Hell, you know. Lost was, it meant that they probably weren't going to get out of this position. And it was coined by a newspaper reporter. And that newspaper reporter was none other than Damon Runyon, who was embedded with the 307th Infantry. He sent this story back to Fred S. Ferguson in the States, who was his editor, and Ferguson sent back one message: send more on Lost Battalion. Lost because it didn't look like they were going to get out of Battalion because it sounded big. Nobody knows what a battalion is. Nobody really knows. It's just a military thing. Send more on Lost Battalion. By the 5th, they were already starting to write articles about these guys. They were heroes before they even got out of the trap that they were in France. So these guys are flying across this ravine, and they're not sure they're in the right place. If you're an Air Corps guy, why would you think that somebody would dig into the side of a hill? That doesn't make sense. He's going to be on the bottom. They couldn't see anything on the bottom. But Bleck thought he saw something near the side of that hill. Wasn't sure, but he thought he saw something. So when they landed, their plane was all shot to hell. But they talked to their commanding officer, Dan Morris. They said, look, we got a new idea. What we want to do is we want to fly over the ravine. And we're not, if we don't know where they are, let's find out where they're not. They'll fly back and forth across the ravine. Let the Germans shoot at them. And Bleck will mark on the map the hot spots. And by process of elimination, they'll know where these guys are. Well, it's virtually suicide. They all knew that it was only a 50-50 chance at best. But they did it anyway. And they took off, and as they're taking off, Dan Morris yells to him to be careful. And Bleck hollers back, don't worry, Lieutenant, we'll find him or we'll die trying. They fly over that afternoon, and they begin making their passes. They are so low in this ravine. They're only about 200, maybe 300 feet up. The hills on the sides of them are above them. They're flying so low and slow across this ravine, the Germans are unloading everything they've got on them. This plane is being shot to hell, and they fly back and forth, and they let it happen. About the third pass, Dad gets a shot to the head, and his head pretty much disappears. Fortunately, there's dual control gears on the DH-4 plane that they were flying. So all of the pilots had taught their backseaters the basics of flying so that they could at least land the plane if they had to. So Bleck gets on the stick, and he starts flying the plane. They come out over the town of Beanerville, and an observer on the ground watched them fly erratically until Bleck got control of the plane, and they were flying steady. So he decides they have 36 hours to pull out. They've already been told they're pulling out of the Argonne because the French are going up this side as they're supposed to. The 28th is moving. The 82nd Division is up here helping out, and the 82nd Division have this certain sergeant that you'll hear something about later on who captures a bunch of guys, but that's a different story for a different time. Anyway, they're starting to be surrounded, so the Germans know they have to pull out of the Argonne Forest. But before they go, this commander says, you know what, I'm going to try to get these guys to give up to save my record. So he sends Hollingshead in, and he comes in, and he says, I have a message for the major. And he delivers it to Whittlesey, and Whittlesey reads this message. And it's at this point that, if you believe the rumor, he turned toward the German lines, which could be any direction since they're surrounded, and yelled that the Germans could go to hell. He never said it. What he did say is he yelled at Hollingshead and said, you had no business leaving your position. Now get back where you belong. He handed the message to McMurtry, who read it and smiled and said, we got him beat. They're asking us to quit. What are we going to do? Whittlesey ordered all the white panels taken in. Nothing white was to show. And he told everybody to get ready because the shit was really going to hit the fan now. And the Germans got their answer when word of that surrender letter went around the hillside, because the guys let them know in no uncertain terms what they could do with their surrender letter, how far and how fast they could shove it. And the Germans attacked that afternoon at about 5:30. This time they came in on the right flank with flamethrowers, and they hit them from every direction. But the men got up out of their hole, and they faced the Germans square and pushed them back. They later said that it was like a controlled riot. the men got up and chased the Germans off. There was no way that they were going to take that hillside. Not this time. No way. They'd been there for 5 days. It wasn't going to happen. At the end of the attack at 7 p.m., they all fell back into the position, and that was it. They were out of ammunition. They were out of food. They were out of everything. They could hear the Germans moving in the forest around them. And they knew if the Germans hit them one more time, that it was over. They'd walk right across that hillside. But it wasn't the Germans. The 307th had managed to break through on the far right, and they came in on the right flank. And as they did, they later said they could smell them from a quarter-mile away. Hardened combat veterans walked onto that hillside and walked back off vomiting. They'd never seen anything like it. There were bodies and body parts everywhere, polluted corpses, entrails hanging in trees, pools of blood, pools of excrement everywhere. But they said worse by far was the shocky, yellow-toothed grin of the survivors. They said there was nothing they could say to them.
Read that one more time.
Stupid plane! They said the worst was the shocky, yellow-toothed grin of the survivors. It wasn't real. They said it was unreal. The next day, when they added everything up, 194 survivors managed to walk out. They took 72% casualties. This is a picture of them on the far left flank as they walked out that afternoon. There was movies taken at the same time. Whittlesey made sure everybody looked good. He was a commander. After the war, the day after Christmas, 1918, Whittlesey was awarded the Medal of Honor for what he did there. They all said for years, we stuck because he stuck. If Whittlesey hadn't been the kind of commander he was, that position would have folded the first day, and there would have been no breakthrough on the line in the Argonne Forest. Because they stayed there, the rest of the line had to fight through to them, to rescue them. That's what broke the line in the Argonne Forest. Otherwise, Germans could have stayed there forever. Whittlesey is the first man in the First World War to be awarded the Medal of Honor. And Pershing later calls him one of the three great soldiers of the war. Charles Whittlesey, Alvin York, and Sam Woodfill are the top three soldiers as far as he was concerned. But there's a price to it. Whittlesey comes home with massive PTSD. He can't deal with the losses that he blames himself for. He can't deal with what happened over there. Nobody wants to hear what he's got to say about anything except what happened in that ravine. They all call him Go to Hell Whittlesey, and he hates that name. On top of that, remember he got gassed on the Vel. In the 1920s and 1930s, the number one killer in America was tuberculosis. And any lung diseases that somebody came home with from the war were referred to as gas-related tuberculosis. Whittlesey was dying of gas-related tuberculosis. His lungs were literally rotting from the inside out because of the gas. He knew he was going to die. He couldn't sleep. He was racked by nightmares and coughing. There was nothing for him. He knew he wasn't going to survive. And on the Saturday after Thanksgiving in 1921, he booked passage on a trip to Havana, and that night he took matters into his own hands. He truly was a casualty of the war. One of the reasons that we do all this is to remind people it doesn't end with the war for a lot of these guys. And the First World War is the first time that they began to really realize that. In 1938, the first book was written about the Lost Battalion, and because of that book, they started the Lost Battalion Survivors Association. They met once a year in New York, and George McMurtry paid for everything. George McMurtry, who was a millionaire before the war, he was an investment banker, he was a millionaire before the war, made even more after the war, and took care of these guys as best as he could after the war. Even though by the time he died in Bar Harbor, Maine, In 1958, he was known as the crotchetiest man in Bar Harbor, Maine, usually referred to as that sick old bastard. The last Survivors Association meeting was in 1968, and from what we've been able to track, the last Lost Battalion survivor died in 1985. You can read about this in the 2 books that I've written on it, Finding the Lost Battalion, Beyond the Rumors, Myths, and Legends of America's Greatest World War I Epic. It's a big, thick book like this. Moves along pretty good, and once you're done, it holds the door open real well. It's a pretty fast read. It looks big, but it's a fast read. Otherwise, you can read The Lost Battalion as They Saw It. That just came out a couple of years ago. This is in their own words. This is 23 biographies of the men and what they saw, what they left behind themselves in their own words. Not always right, but it's very interesting to see how they did it. Also, you can go out with us on Lost Battalion tours. You can take Muse Argonne tours over there once a year. We go for a week. We'll walk you through the Muse Argonne, show you where all this stuff happened. From the ground, you see it from the doughboy's perspective, including one entire day where we just followed the Lost Battalion story. We also cater to special requests. If there's something in the area you really want to see, we'll do our best to take you over there to see it. Not a problem. You can contact me online. Very easy to get a hold of me. You just look for that Lost Battalion idiot, and I come up. It's not a problem. Otherwise, findingthelostbattalion.com, 308 Infantry at Gmail, or look us up on Facebook at Finding the Lost Battalion and the Lost Battalion Tours. Anybody have any questions? Thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of the day. And if you do have questions, I'll be wandering around. So, thank you. All right, you can go now.